August 14th, 2005, Larnaca International Airport, Cyprus. Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737, sits on the tarmac preparing for what should be a routine 2-hour flight to Athens, Greece, and then on to Prague. On board are 115 passengers and 6 crew members, families heading for vacation, business travelers, couples returning home. Among them, 2 young boys traveling alone to see their grandfather. It's a beautiful Sunday morning. The sun is shining, everyone is excited. The pilots complete their pre-flight checks. Everything appears normal. The plane takes off at 9:07 a.m., climbing steadily into the clear blue sky over the Mediterranean Sea. But something is terribly, terribly wrong. Within minutes, warning alarms start blaring in the cockpit. The pilots are confused. They're trying to figure out what's happening. They contact the ground. They're reporting problems. And then, just 20 minutes into the flight, all radio communications stops. Complete silence. Air traffic controllers try desperately to reach them. No response. Fighter jets are scrambled to intercept Flight 522, and when they finally catch up to Flight 522 and look into the cockpit windows, what they see makes their blood run cold. The pilots are slumped over, not moving, not responding. The plane is flying itself at 34,000 feet, cruising on autopilot with everyone on board unconscious. And here's the most chilling part. This ghost plane would continue flying for almost 3 more hours, with 121 people slowly dying inside, until it ran out of fuel and crashed into a hillside near Athens, killing everyone on board. But friends, what you don't know yet is that one person actually woke up. One flight attendant regained consciousness in those final moments and desperately tried to save the plane. This is the story of how a simple mistake, a tiny oversight during maintenance, turned a routine flight into one of aviation's most haunting disasters. Let me take you back to the beginning. Helios Airways was a low-cost Cypriot airline, only 3 years old in 2005. They were trying to compete with bigger airlines by offering cheaper flights, which meant cutting costs wherever possible. The Boeing 737 that would become Flight 522 had been experiencing some issues. Just the night before this flight, on August 13th, passengers on a previous flight had complained about a door seal. The plane was making strange noises. Air seemed to be leaking. So the airline's engineers did what they were supposed to do. They conducted a pressurization leak check overnight. This is a standard procedure where engineers test the plane's ability to maintain cabin pressure at high altitude. To do this test, they had to switch the pressurization system from its normal automatic mode to manual mode. Now, here's where the fatal mistake happens. After completing the test, someone forgot to switch it back to automatic. Just one switch, one simple toggle that remained in the wrong position. And nobody caught it. Not the engineers who finished the test, not the next maintenance crew, not during the pre-flight inspection. That switch stayed in manual mode. The plane's logbook showed the pressurization test had been completed and everything looked fine on paper. The captain that morning was Hans-Jürgen Merten, a 58-year-old German pilot with over 16,000 hours of experience. His co-pilot was Pampas Charalambos, 51 years old, a Cypriot with thousands of hours himself. These were not inexperienced pilots. These were professionals. Among the passengers were Andreas and Theo Dimitriou, 2 boys aged 5 and 8, traveling without their parents to visit their grandfather in Athens. There was also Andreas Rovas, a 29-year-old nursing student who was working as a flight attendant to pay for his studies. He had just become certified to work in the cockpit as relief crew. At 9:07 a.m., Flight 522 takes off. Everything seems normal. The plane climbs, the flight attendants prepare to serve drinks, passengers are settling in, reading magazines, some dozing off already. But as the plane climbs above 10,000 feet, something invisible and deadly begins to happen. You see, as a plane climbs higher, the air outside becomes thinner. There's less oxygen. At 34,000 feet, there's not enough oxygen for humans to survive. That's why planes have pressurization systems that compress the air inside the cabin, making it feel like you're only at 6,000 or 8,000 feet, even when you're actually at 35,000 feet. But this only works if the system is in automatic mode. In manual mode, the system does nothing. It just sits there. And that's exactly what was happening on Flight 522. As the plane climbed higher and higher, the cabin pressure was dropping. The air was getting thinner. And at 9:19 a.m., just 12 minutes after takeoff, warning alarms started going off. The pilots heard a loud horn blaring. This is called the takeoff configuration warning, and it makes the same sound as another warning, the altitude warning, which indicates a pressurization problem. But here's the tragic confusion. The takeoff configuration warning normally only sounds when the plane is on the ground, so the pilots, hearing this alarm in the air, thought it must be a false alarm or an equipment malfunction. They didn't immediately think it was a pressurization issue. Captain Merton contacted Helios operations on the ground. His voice is still calm at this point, but you can hear the concern. He's saying the warning won't stop. The cooling system seems to be malfunctioning. Cooling, he said, not pressurization. The company's engineers on the ground started troubleshooting with him, trying to figure out what's wrong, but they're all looking at the wrong problem. Nobody's checking the cabin pressure. Nobody's looking at that one switch that's still in manual mode. And every minute that passes, the oxygen in the cabin is getting lower and lower. At around 9:30 a.m., the plane reaches its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. At this height, without proper pressurization, the effects of hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, begin within seconds. Your brain is the first thing affected. You start feeling dizzy, confused. Your judgment becomes impaired. You might feel euphoric, drunk even. You don't realize anything is wrong. This is the most dangerous part of hypoxia. You don't know it's happening. You think you're fine. You think clearly, but you're not thinking clearly at all. Your reactions slow down. Your vision narrows. And then, within just a few minutes, you lose consciousness. The last radio transmission from Flight 522 came at 9:20 a.m. The captain sounded slightly breathless, a bit confused. He was still trying to troubleshoot the cooling system. And then, silence. Nothing. Air traffic control in Athens kept trying to contact them. They're calling the flight again and again. Flight 522, do you read? Flight 522, please respond. Nothing. At this point, friends, everyone on that plane was already unconscious or rapidly losing consciousness. The two pilots in the cockpit, confused from hypoxia, unable to process what was happening, probably slumped forward within minutes. The 115 passengers in the back, most of whom were already feeling sleepy from the thin air, simply never woke up. The oxygen masks did deploy automatically, as they're supposed to when cabin pressure drops. But here's the thing. Those emergency oxygen masks only provide oxygen for about 12 to 15 minutes. They're designed to give you air while the pilots descend the plane to a safe altitude. But if the pilots are unconscious, if nobody's flying the plane down, those masks run out, and then there's nothing. Can you imagine, friends, a plane full of people cruising peacefully through the sky at 34,000 feet, all of them unconscious, all of them slowly dying from lack of oxygen? The plane's autopilot is still working perfectly. It's maintaining altitude, maintaining course, flying exactly as programmed, but inside, it's a tomb. By 10 a.m., about an hour into the flight, Greek air traffic control realized something was seriously wrong. This plane is not responding. It's heading towards Athens airspace, but nobody's talking to them. They alerted the Greek Air Force. 2 F-16 fighter jets were scrambled from Nea Anchialos Air Base. These jets took off with one mission: intercept Flight 522 and see what's happening. At 11:24 a.m., more than 2 hours after takeoff, the F-16s caught up with the Boeing 737. The fighter pilots pulled up alongside the passenger plane, close enough to see inside the cockpit windows. And what they saw would haunt them forever. The captain was slumped over the controls. The co-pilot's seat appeared empty, but later they realized he had fallen backward out of view. The fighter pilots reported back to base. They said, "Nobody's flying this plane. The cockpit is empty." One pilot later described it as the most eerie thing he'd ever seen. This massive passenger plane flying perfectly straight, perfectly stable, but completely dead inside. The fighter jet stayed with Flight 522, flying alongside it, watching helplessly as this ghost plane continued on its programmed route. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. One person on that plane actually woke up. Andreas Rovas, the 29-year-old flight attendant who was certified for cockpit operations, somehow regained consciousness. Maybe he was younger, stronger. Maybe he was moving around when hypoxia set in, so it affected him differently. We'll never know exactly why, but around 11:49 a.m., the fighter pilots saw something that gave them hope: movement in the cockpit. Someone had entered the flight deck. A man in a blue shirt, not a pilot's uniform. It was Andreas. He had woken up, realized something was catastrophically wrong, and made his way to the cockpit. The fighter pilots started waving, gesturing, trying to communicate with him. They could see him looking at them, seeing the fighter jets right outside the window. He waved back. Andreas sat down in the captain's seat. He was trying to take control of the plane. Think about this for a moment. He's a flight attendant with some cockpit training, but he's not a pilot. He's just regained consciousness after being oxygen deprived for nearly 2 hours. His brain is still foggy, he's weak, disoriented, and now he's sitting in front of hundreds of instruments, switches, controls, trying to save a plane that's been flying itself at 34,000 feet. The fighter pilots later said they saw him putting on an oxygen mask. He was trying to stay conscious. They saw him looking at the controls, touching different switches. He was trying to figure out how to communicate, how to descend the plane, how to do anything. But here's the crushing reality. At this point, the plane had been flying for nearly 3 hours, and it had taken off with just enough fuel for a 2-hour flight to Athens, maybe a bit extra for safety. At 11:49 a.m., almost exactly when Andreas reached the cockpit, the left engine ran out of fuel and shut down. The plane started banking to the right because only one engine was working. Andreas was now trying to control a plane with one engine, something even experienced pilots would struggle with. The fighter pilots saw the plane starting to descend. They thought maybe, just maybe, he could bring it down. They were radioing instructions, even though they knew he probably couldn't hear them. They were praying for a miracle. But at 11:54 a.m., just 5 minutes after Andreas entered the cockpit, the right engine also ran out of fuel. Both engines were dead. The plane was now a 50-ton glider falling from the sky. The autopilot disconnected. All the electrical systems started failing. Inside that cockpit, Andreas would have seen every warning light imaginable flashing red, every alarm screaming. The plane was dropping fast. At 12:03 p.m., Flight 522 crashed into a hillside near the village of Grammatico, about 25 miles north of Athens International Airport. The impact was catastrophic. The plane hit the ground at high speed and exploded. Debris scattered across the mountainside. Fire erupted. When rescue workers arrived, they found a scene of absolute devastation. Wreckage everywhere, personal belongings scattered across the hills, suitcases, shoes, children's toys, and 121 bodies. Every single person on board was gone. The 2 young boys traveling to see their grandfather, the experienced pilots, the passengers who had no idea anything was wrong, and Andreas, the flight attendant who woke up in the final moments and desperately tried to save them all. The investigation that followed uncovered the full horror of what happened. Investigators found that pressurization switch still in manual mode. They listened to the cockpit voice recorder and heard the confusion in the pilots' voices as hypoxia set in. They reviewed the maintenance logs and found the pressurization test that had been done the night before. One switch, one oversight, one moment of human error that killed 121 people. But here's what makes this even tragic. There were so many chances to catch this mistake. The engineer who did the test should have switched it back. The next maintenance crew should have checked. The pilots should have noticed during their pre-flight inspection. In fact, there's a specific gauge on the Boeing 737 that shows cabin altitude. If the pilots had looked at it after takeoff, they would have seen the cabin altitude climbing dangerously high. But they were distracted by the warning horn, focused on the wrong problem, and then hypoxia impaired their judgment before they could figure it out. The families of the victims were devastated. Some sued Helios Airways, others sued Boeing, arguing that the warning system was confusing. The airline eventually shut down in 2006, unable to survive the financial and reputational damage. Several people were charged with manslaughter, including the airline CEO and the chief pilot. The maintenance manager who forgot to switch the pressurization mode back to automatic was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But friends, here's the thing. This wasn't just one person's fault. This was a chain of failures, a cheese Swiss model of disaster where multiple layers of safety failed one after another until catastrophe was inevitable. Andreas Rovas, the flight attendant who woke up and tried to save the plane, was hailed as a hero. His family said he had always dreamed of being a pilot. In those final moments, he got to sit in the captain's seat. He fought until the very end. If the plane had just a bit more fuel, if he'd woken up 10 minutes earlier, maybe he could have done it. We'll never know. His body was identified among the wreckage, still in the cockpit where he had died trying to save everyone. After this disaster, aviation authorities around the world implemented new safety protocols. Pressurization checks now require explicit confirmation that systems are returned to normal mode. Pilots receive additional training on recognizing hypoxia symptoms. Warning systems were redesigned to be less ambiguous. But none of that brings back the 121 people who died on Flight 522. You know, friends, what haunts me most about this story is how preventable it was. A simple checklist item, one person taking one extra second to verify that switch. That's all it would have taken. And it makes you think about your own life, doesn't it? How many times do we skip the small steps because we're in a hurry? How many times do we assume something is fine without checking? The people who boarded Flight 522 that morning had no idea they were stepping onto a plane that was already doomed. They trusted that every safety check had been done, that every procedure had been followed, that the professionals knew what they were doing. And in most cases, that trust is well placed. But sometimes, just sometimes, human error slips through every layer of protection. The story of the ghost plane reminds us that in aviation, there's no room for assumptions. Every switch matters, every check matters, every procedure matters, because at 34,000 feet, there are no second chances. If you found this story compelling and want to hear another incredible tale of survival and disaster, I highly recommend watching the video about the Tenerife airport disaster, the deadliest accident in aviation history, where 2 Boeing 747s collided on a foggy runway and the small decisions that led to 583 deaths. You can click right here to watch that next. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, every safety rule in aviation was written in blood. Let's make sure those lessons are never forgotten.